Good evening and welcome to the Sadhguru Center Speaker Series. This is a special event happening just the day after International Yoga Day 2022. So we're really delighted to have you all celebrating this momentous occasion with us at Sadhguru Center. And today we're welcoming you to our monthly Speaker Series events where we present virtual lectures and discussions highlighting the research and explorations of our multidisciplinary community of scientists, global leaders, and thought leaders. So for those of you joining us for the very first time, Sadhguru Center is a multidisciplinary research center based at the Department of Anesthesia, Critical Care, and Pain Medicine at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center here at the Harvard Hospital System in Boston. And we aim to bring tools of well-being to both patients and healthcare providers to enhance consciousness, cognition, and compassion. Our work really happens at the nexus of research, education, and outreach. We offer wellness programs, we conduct scientific studies in various communities, and we bring together world leaders from diverse fields to collaborate and innovate health and well-being solutions. So if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about our center, there'll be a link to our website in the chat, and you can click on it to learn more. And without further ado, I would love to introduce to you our speaker for today, as well as our really exciting topic, yoga, the biomedical science and research. And this is particularly exciting because it's tied in with our theme of International Yoga Day. This whole week we're celebrating. And joining us today is Dr. Bir Singh Khalsa, who is the Director of Yoga Research for the Yoga Alliance and the Kundalini Research Institute. He's also an Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. And he has conducted scientific yoga research since 2001 on yoga for insomnia, stress, anxiety disorders, and in workplace and school settings, and is a practitioner and instructor of Kundalini Yoga since 1973. So welcome, Dr. Khalsa. It's wonderful to have you with us today, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for this invitation to be able to speak with you all, especially on what we might call International Yoga Week. So my focus in this lecture is really to share with you an understanding of the biomedical science and research on basically how yoga works. What are the mechanisms? What happens to us when we practice yoga, and what's the research that kind of supports that? And first of all, I need to define what we mean by the term yoga. And of course, yoga for most people is definitely associated with the postures and the exercises you see depicted in this slide here. They are very different than Western type aerobic exercises. They're much more focused on isometrics, flexibility. They have inverted postures, and the experience of these exercises is very different than what we experience in aerobic type exercises in the West. And I believe research will eventually show that these types of exercises are more conducive to developing sort of relaxed states. However, yoga is not just postures and exercises, although there are a lot of yoga teachers and yoga classes across the United States which do teach nothing but postures. I refer to that really as sort of a limited form of yoga, because traditional yoga has more components than that. And the components that are most important and most used in research studies and taught in traditional yoga classes in the United States incorporate not just the postures and exercises, but also the breathing techniques, or the pranayama, the deep relaxation, often experienced as the corpse pose or shavasana, and very importantly, the meditative component. And for those of us who are scholars and academics, a strong argument can be made that the most important component of yoga practice is actually meditation, and that the physical components are very important, but they are there really to support and promote this deeper meditative component of yoga practice. So let's turn our attention to the research, the basic research on the psychophysiology of yoga. How does yoga work on the mind and on the body? And there's a growing body of basic research on yoga and its mechanisms, and that's reflected actually in the review papers and meta-analyses that are being published to look at the different effects of yoga practice on the mind and body. And these are an example of some of these review papers. This one at the top on how yoga reduces stress, yoga and immune system functioning below that neurophysiological and neurocognitive mechanisms, below that stress again, and at the bottom potential self-regulatory mechanisms of yoga for psychological health. We've also summarized, and this research is, as I say, growing very dramatically. When you look at PubMed citations for the word meta-analysis or review in the title and the word yoga in the title, you can see this dramatic increase. At the beginning of the 21st century, for this first decade, you can see a very small increase, but look at the dramatic increase over the past 12 years. This is a remarkable escalation of reviews and meta-analyses on yoga, with 2020 showing almost 50 such publications. We've also reviewed this research on the psychophysiology of yoga in our medical textbook, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. And this is a modern scientific textbook. It's an edited medical textbook with 60 leading yoga researchers contributing to this book. And chapter 4 covers the research on the psychophysiology of yoga. Now, going back in history, some of the early research that started to look at yoga was looking at advanced yoga practitioners. And one of the studies that was really key in this was a year-long study conducted in the 50s, where this team of researchers you see in this photograph traveled around India for an entire year, hooking up these advanced yogis that they could induce to participate in the study and studying physiologically what was going on. And the conclusion from that extensive study was that physiologically, yogic meditation represents deep relaxation of the autonomic nervous system. And there's two important characteristics here. One is the whole idea of self-regulation of the autonomic nervous system, which was believed to be automatic. So here are these individuals through these training yoga practices being able to self-regulate internal state, both psychological and physiological. And that's highly significant because it's not something that is really in modern medicine. In modern medicine, with respect to the patient-doctor relationship, the doctor does something to the patient. And the whole idea of the patient being able to exert some kind of self-control over internal functioning is really not a prominent part of modern medicine. The other important feature here is the autonomic nervous system itself, which is one of the systems that's involved in the mediation of the stress and emotion response. And another system that is mediating the stress response is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, whose output is the stress hormone cortisol. And I'm going to show you how yoga practitioners are able to now self-regulate both of these stress and emotion response systems. Now, one example of this self-regulation, which is actually an anecdote, was sort of a study that was done, an N of one, if you will, on Swami Rama, one of the many yoga masters who came to the West in the late 60s and early 70s. And this was a study that was done by Elmer Green, who actually turned out to be the founder of the field of biofeedback. And they had Swami Rama in a room at the Menninger Clinic and sitting in a chair, and they had wired up temperature sensors to both sides of the same hand, measuring skin temperature. And just by sitting there through a force of mental will, not really doing anything overt, he was able to increase the skin temperature on one side of the hand while simultaneously decreasing skin temperature on the other side of the same hand. Now, skin temperature is controlled by the rate of blood flow through the blood vessels in the skin, and that's controlled by autonomic nerves that innervate the blood vessels. So on one side of the hand, he's vasodilating blood vessels to increase blood flow. On the other side, he's vasoconstricting blood vessels. So he has clearly control of autonomic function, but not only autonomic function, he's able to distinguish control between the left and right sides of the same hand. And I like this anecdote because it tells us that in modern science, we have very little conception of how deep this ability to self-regulate internal state can go. And this is what yoga is all about, in part, is this whole idea of self-regulation. Now, of course, the asanas can be measured very objectively. We can measure those in degrees of motion. We can measure them in terms of things like oxygen uptake, flexibility, muscular endurance, and muscle strength. And many studies have been done on the asanas. This is just example of one study that took naive individuals, gave them yoga for a few months, and indeed saw statistically significant improvements in a wide variety of measures. And so there's a strong body of evidence showing that we can change physical functioning, especially flexibility, with these types of physical practices. Now, another component of yoga, of course, is the deep relaxation. And in yoga, we practice Shavasana, but in the West, this has been called progressive relaxation, which was started in 1948 and actually became a part of modern psychological techniques. And it's very similar to Shavasana. It's muscular relaxation. You relax all the muscles in the body. And in this randomized controlled trial, they looked at a number of outcome measures. And so one of them was perceived stress. And the progressive relaxation group is in the black bars here. And you can see that after the intervention, they were lowering their perceived stress, whereas the control group had a little change. They also were able to lower their state trait anxiety index scores, whereas the control group had no change. They also were able to increase their perceived sense of relaxation compared to the control group. And in an objective measure, they were able to reduce their heart rate compared to normals that did not practice. And in another objective measure of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, salivary cortisol was also reduced after the progressive relaxation practice compared to the control subjects. Pranayama is another another element of yoga practice, and the most dominant form of pranayama is the long, slow, deep breathing pattern. And we're starting to see remarkable studies coming out to show the breadth and depth of how these slow breathing practices can change both mental and physical functioning. In this example here, in this randomized trial, they were able to show that those individuals that did abdominal slow breathing were able to lower their systolic blood pressure by almost 10 points, which is a significant clinical drop during the practice. And in fact, there's now a whole body of literature of researchers starting to study the effects of slow breathing for things like hypertension. In another example, this randomized controlled trial had individuals in both groups of this study experienced a stressor. And one group did slow breathing practice and the other group did not. And what you can see is that the slow breathing group had a lower abated stress response compared to the controls that did not practice the slow breathing. And other studies are also showing remarkable changes. We're starting to see that slow breathing can have a direct impact on emotional regulation. It can have a direct impact on pain regulation. And it's also a highly efficient form of breathing. It can maintain oxygen saturation under challenging circumstances such as high altitude. And then finally, there's the meditative component of yoga practice. And meditation, most simply defined, is the relaxed focus of attention. And the difference in different forms of meditation is the target of meditation. In yoga, it's commonly single point focus or concentrated meditation, in which you focus on a mantra, a word, a phrase, a candle, or the breath. Or it can be open focus meditation, which is typically referred to as mindfulness meditation, more in the Buddhist traditions, in which the target is actually the flow of thought itself or the flow of sensation. In either case, you're engaging the attention networks of the brain. You're focusing attention. And what happens during meditation, of course, is that the mind then wanders, but then you bring the focus back. But with continued practice, you become better and better at engaging the attention networks in meditation. One of the kinds of studies that's been done is to ask the question, do the brains of long-term meditators behave differently than non-meditators? A number of studies have looked at this question, and this is one example of that. In this study, they did see changes, and the observed changes appear in structures that underlie the attention network, and also those that relate to emotion and autonomic function. So the objective evidence matches the behavioral evidence in terms of emotion and autonomic function. And of course, it's no surprise that the attention networks are changing because the whole practice of meditation is repeated engagement of the attention networks in focusing attention. Another technique that can be done with the brain imaging is to actually look at a single molecule. This is work by Chris Streeter at Boston University. And what she did was she did brain scanning before and after a single yoga class. And she was able to image a single neurotransmitter called GABA, a well-known inhibitory neurotransmitter throughout the central nervous system that is associated with mood state. And what she was able to show in these studies is that GABA was increased after just a single yoga class. And these improvements and increases in GABA were associated with an improvement in emotional mood state. So not only can we change brain activity with these practices, we can change brain biochemistry. Now, another phenomenon is neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to change its structure in response to human behavior. And of course, yoga is a behavior, so can yoga change brain plasticity? This is a study that was done at our National Institutes of Health. They were looking at cold pain tolerance in long-term yoga practitioners who are depicted here in the black dots. And what you can see is that on average, their pain tolerance was higher than it was in the non-yoga practitioners in the open circles here. At the same time, they also calculated the volume through brain imaging of that region of the brain that's involved in pain regulation. And what they showed is that the gray matter volume in that region of the brain was larger in the yoga practitioners on average than it was in the non-yoga practitioners. And when they correlated the duration of years of yoga practice of the long-term yoga practitioners against the volume of that region of the brain, you can see a significant correlation, such that the longer they had practiced, the larger that region of the brain was. So what this is telling us with very powerful objective measure is that yoga is having a clinically and statistically significant impact on brain activity, on brain biochemistry, and on brain structure itself. So this quote says, meditation isn't what you think. And this quote has double meaning. Most people consider that people that meditate go into this trance state and then come out later sometime, and there's no thoughts whatsoever during that trance state. And that's really a misconception of what meditation is. Meditation is actually a cycle of focus interrupted by mind wandering. So in the real world, meditation is this cycle of successful focus and then lapsing into mind wandering, recognizing the mind wandering, and then coming back into the focus phase. That's what meditation really is in the real world. And so in order to understand the impacts of that activity, we need to understand not just one side, but the other. We need to understand not just the focus phase, but also what is the mind wandering phase. And in fact, mind wandering is becoming a target for research itself. And this has been studied by no less than a Harvard group and published in our premier biomedical journal, Science. These researchers studied mind wandering in the general population. And what they found was, not surprisingly, that people's minds wandered frequently, regardless of what they were doing. So that's not that exciting or novel. But the interesting finding was that people were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not wandering. And so they concluded that the ability to think about what is not happening, in other words, mind wandering, is a cognitive achievement that comes at an emotional cost. So why would there be an emotional cost? Why would you be less happy if you're prone to mind wandering? And the answer to that really lies in the content of mind wandering. What is it that we're mind wandering about? And actually, mind wandering is a survival feature that humans have. We're able to analyze the past, predict the future, because that's where we're thinking, past and future. Now, one of the biggest issues for us, of course, is survival. And so a lot of our mind wandering is really dominated by survival. Now, it's no longer the cave, the saber-toothed lion at the cave of at the mouth of the cave, but it is, will I be able to balance my checkbook? Will I be able to afford my mortgage? Will I be able to send my child to university, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And we are constantly thinking about those kinds of survival thoughts. And as you do that 24/7, 365 days of the year, lo and behold, you're ending up with a mood disorder. So how does meditation fit into this? Well, as you focus your attention, what happens is mind wandering ceases, because the attention networks can only do one thing at a time. So if you're focused, you're focused. Otherwise, the mind slips into mind wandering. So for at least the amount of time you're focusing your attention, you are in essentially a vacation or a holiday from these negative thoughts. But what is more important is that in practice over time, you're developing the skill of regulating your thought processes. And ultimately, this leads to a change in the relationship between you and your thought processes, such that you now recognize that you have the ability to change your reactivity to your own thoughts. In fact, you can even change the content of your thoughts if you so choose. And that comes with the realization that, of course, you are not your thoughts, because you're able to self-regulate those thoughts. And this is a state we call metacognition. And metacognition is very important. In fact, it is the key construct behind the most powerful and universally used form of psychotherapy today, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. The idea that changing thoughts will change psychological conditions. So this is really common to meditation and cognitive behavioral therapy, and really accounts for the efficacy of meditative-like practices like yoga in improving mental state and well-being. We can actually see this cycle of mind wandering and focus in the scanner. This is a study that was done with meditators in the brain scanner, and they were able to show that during the focus phase of meditation, what's being activated is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is in the frontal lobes, in the executive regions of the brain where the attention networks are. Whereas mind wandering is associated with much more diffuse collection of brain regions called the default mode network. And what we're starting to understand is the neurophysiology and the neuroscience of all of this relationship between meditation and mind wandering. We know that the prefrontal cortex has inhibitory connections with the limbic system, which is the emotional brain where the stress and emotion response take place. So as you meditate longer, you exert this negative inhibitory effect over the limbic system. In fact, it's been shown that long-term meditators actually have a smaller amygdala, which is at the heart of the limbic system. We're also starting to see that long-term meditators are more resistant to mood disturbances, where default mode network people tend to be more prone to developing mood conditions. So this understanding is really now happening at the neurophysiological level, where we're starting to understand the relationship between these brain regions and how meditation affects them over time. Now, one of the things I've been mentioning all along so far is the role of yoga in stress management. And this is a major outcome of yoga. It's perhaps one of the most profound things that beginners experience with yoga. And in fact, this is supported by the research. I would say that virtually every study that has looked at a stress outcome in a yoga intervention has showed positive benefit. And that's reflected in the reviews. In this review published in 2020, this review revealed that most types of yoga have positive effects on stress reduction in healthy populations. Now, many of the studies done are looking at self-report measures such as the perceived stress scale, but we also have research on objective measures. And so this review paper focused on that and showed studies consistent with reduced evening cortisol, waking cortisol, systolic blood pressure, heart rate variability, blood glucose, and even blood lipids. Overall, indicating an improved regulation of the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system. And just to give you some examples from our own work, this is a study we did in the UK on healthcare workers. These are clerical workers in a building in Wales in the UK, and we showed in a randomized controlled trial that the yoga group after 8 weeks showed a statistically significant improvement in perceived stress, whereas the controls had no change. And then we also have worked with the Kundalini Center for Yoga and Health in a program they devised for implementation in the workplace and also on site. And this was a study of a retreat in which participants came, a sample size of 71 from education, healthcare, and corrections occupations in a residential 5-day Kripalu program, and we showed reductions in perceived stress at the end of the program. That's no surprise. But what was really valuable was the fact that the gains were largely maintained at the long-term follow-up, as they were with resilience to stress, staying high after the end of the program. We've also seen this in a shorter program with education professionals, mostly teachers, in a randomized trial. You can see perceived stress dropping in the yoga group in the black bars here by the long-term follow-up, and resilience increasing by the long-term follow-up, whereas the controls had no change over time. We've also implemented the program at Brigham and Women's Hospital for Harvard physicians. And this was a 6-week intervention delivered at the hospital, and we saw reductions in perceived stress maintained at the long-term follow-up and improvements in resilience maintained at the long-term follow-up. And the Sadhguru Center itself has published recent studies showing that indeed a short online intervention of an Isha Yoga program can show reductions in perceived stress scores after 6 weeks of practice. We've also done a study with the Benson Henry Institute for Mind-Body Medicine comparing yoga with simple meditation with a stress education control group. All 3 interventions showed reductions in perceived stress and state anxiety. with perhaps the yoga and meditation, the yoga group showing slightly lower declines. But what was really interesting was that the imaging data showed that it was the yoga and meditation groups that were able to maintain hippocampal volume, whereas the other group, which was slightly stressed, showed declines in hippocampal volume over time. And that is characteristic of chronic stress. Mind-body awareness is another outcome that occurs after yoga practice. And this study done in Germany looked at long-term yoga practitioners and measured their scores of mindfulness or mind-body awareness. And what you can see is that they divided this population up into high practitioners, moderate level, and marginal practitioners. And you can see virtually a dose-response curve. Those practicing at a higher level had higher scores of mindfulness. And we've also seen this in our study. This is the Kripalu RISE program that I mentioned that we've implemented. And we see improvements in mindfulness in the 5-day retreat program that were maintained at the long-term follow-up. This was the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire. We saw it in education professionals, increasing at the end of the 6 weeks and maintained. And then also in the Harvard physicians at the hospital, increasing scores on mindfulness that were maintained. And you've also seen this actually in the Sadhguru Center study with the MOS scores improving over time after 6 weeks. Now, yoga historically was associated with the achievement of these contemplative states of consciousness, and there is a sort of a temporal relationship. There's over the short term, there's a arousal reduction and sense of physical and mental well-being that occurs over minutes. With practice over weeks and months, we see improvements in mind-body awareness, mindfulness, resilience to stress, and self-regulation. But many people report over months and years of practice, regular practice, sort of psychological and philosophical transformation. And this likely comes from the experiences of these contemplative transcendent states during the yoga practice, and particularly the meditation. And so this study, which was the German study of long-term yoga practitioners, applied a spiritual well-being questionnaire and showed that indeed it was the high-level practitioners that had higher scores of spiritual well-being. And on subscales of hope, connectedness, and experiences of sense and meaning, which are positive psychological states, they also scored much higher. But we can see these changes over the short term. These are studies done at the Deepak Chopra Center, and they compared individuals who stayed at the center and did not do the yoga and meditation practices with those that did. And indeed, the active practicing groups had improvements in spirituality and non-dual embodiment, which are characteristic of these deeper experiences. And we've also done this with young adult musicians. We applied the flow questionnaire to young musicians at the Summer Tanglewood Music Center program and showed that their scores of dispositional flow, this merger in their performance, was increased after 6 weeks of yoga. And the autotelic experience, that unitive state of consciousness, also increasing. So from all of this, we can construct a logic model. So yoga, as I've said, is postures, breathing, relaxation, and meditation. It is through all 4 of these, either independently, alone, or together in yoga, we see changes in the physical level in a box I'm calling fitness, things like flexibility, strength, coordination, balance, respiratory function, and self-efficacy. It's also through all 4 of these independently or together in yoga, we're improving self-regulation of internal state, both psychological and physiological, the most important being stress and emotion regulation, which over time with practice leads to resilience to stress and emotional equanimity, leading to an overall mental self-efficacy. It's primarily through the meditative component that we're engaging the attention networks through meditative practices, improving mind-body awareness and mindfulness. That improves cognition and concentration, and over time, we're leading to a state of metacognition. And then finally, meditation is also likely responsible for the unitive states that occur, leading to transcendence experiences, flow state, which leads individuals to a deeper transformation, a change in life meaning and purpose in a box I'm referring to as spirituality. And one thing you can see from this model is we're making changes across a broad spectrum of human functioning, from the gross level of connective tissue and muscle to the deepest experiences that humans can have. And this leads to a global human functionality, from the gross level of physical and mental health and performance to the stress and emotion regulation, awareness and mindfulness and metacognition, to the deeper positive psychological states, positive behaviors, well-being, values, life purpose and meaning, and spirituality. So this really summarizes what the research has provided, and the strongest research is here because this is very objective. And over the past 2 to 3 decades, the research on self-regulation and awareness has made enormous strides in really showing us the neuroscience of how these phenomena are manifesting with yoga practice. And just to give you a sense of the reality of this, if you look at these 4 boxes, these 4 constructs, we've seen this in our studies. So these are studies that we've done with the workplace populations. So, and I've categorized them in terms of fitting into these modes. So in the category of fitness, one participant said the week at Kripalu was amazing and made me realize how good I can feel and so quickly. I felt better in my body, stronger and straighter, clear-headed, and more balanced. Another said, I feel the most physically and mentally healthy I have ever felt in my adult life. And finally, another said, a week in which I felt more relaxed than I can even remember. In terms of self-regulation, one said, I'm better able to handle my emotions. I can stay calm and centered in trying times. Another said, it's a huge shift in how I process stress, both professional and personal. It lifted me out of burnout. In terms of awareness, the Kripalu experience helped me become aware of just how unaware I was of myself and my body. Another said, I am more mindful of how food, breathing, and mindfulness can affect my performance and state of mind. And another, given me the skills necessary to notice my emotions before acting on them. And although these were short interventions and 2-month follow-up, we can still see some sort of preliminary evidence of spirituality. One said, this has been a life-changing grounding experience. Another said, I have noticed a positive shift in my entire life. And finally, another said, it's a renewed sense of purpose, increased appreciation for life, stillness, mindfulness, and nature, life-changing. Now, these interventions were all done in research studies, but a colleague of mine, Gina Cartwright at the University of Westminster, conducted an online UK survey of practitioners of yoga. And she contacted yoga organizations, studios, events. All of the individuals participating had practiced yoga within the past 12 months were over 18, and they answered free text questions about the style and practice duration, health improvements, health issues, and other comments that they had. This was a sample size of 2,400, mostly female, mostly white, and actually 40% yoga teachers. And what she did was sort of look qualitatively at the results that matched our logic model. And in fact, virtually all of the elements of the logic model that we had based upon the research studies were matched very well with the outcomes that they were getting from these practitioners in the real world. The differences you can see here is that they added some things that research has still not looked at. So posture and muscle tension, the word coping really very similar to resilience, focus really similar to concentration. They added personal growth as a common term. They also talked about relationships improvement, and we have not seen much of that in the research yet with respect to yoga. And they also referred to successful aging and improved energy, also constructs which have not seen research. So this logic model really holds up not just with respect to the research populations, but also in the general public who are practicing yoga. So I work closely with the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, who supported a lot of our work, especially with the music performance studies and the studies in the workplace settings. I also work as the Director of Research for the Kundalini Research Institute, supporting the style of yoga I practice. I'm also working with the International Association of Yoga Therapists. I'm the editor of the International Journal of Yoga Therapy, and also coordinate the annual Symposium on Yoga Research, which this year is being held at the Kripalu Yoga Center. This is our 10th year, and this is our opportunity to really promote and advance the field of research on yoga. And I also work as the Director of Yoga Research for the Yoga Alliance. My goal there is yoga research literacy, training and teaching yoga teachers and practitioners about the research on yoga through videos, webinars, and even citations that are collated on the website. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Indeed, thank you so much. It was really wonderful to hear the whirlwind tour of entire research. There's a lot of information packed in there. I'll start with a very basic question, right? Often we are blamed for research not being very robust in the field of yoga. So for a starter, what do you see as the best design for studying any intervention especially for behavioral outcomes?
Well, I mean, I think we're no further away from being able to study yoga than psychologists are in studying psychological state. I mean, it's the same kind of thing. We're looking at behaviors, we're looking at psychological and physiological state. And I think obviously we want to move towards randomized controlled trials. We want to move towards large sample sizes. We want to move to objective measures wherever we can. All of those things require a lot more money, a lot more funding to be able to conduct those kinds of studies because of the cost involved, the extra staff involved in those kinds of outcome measures, especially in large sample size. And we just don't have that funding at this point in time. I mean, yoga research is really in its infancy. And funding is hard to come by, especially for the longer term, larger sample size studies. But it is growing. The glass is half full as well as being half empty. And compared to where we were 20 years ago, we are much farther ahead than we were. And I think that we are using validated questionnaires whenever possible, and that's the same as any field of psychology is doing.
The follow-up to that is recently some of our lab members went to the integrative medicine meeting, and which was in Arizona, and they met some of the NIH program officers. And shockingly, what I heard from them was one of the program officers said, "Oh, a lot of yoga research has been done. We need to put money in somewhere else." So I was a little shocked to hear that. And what is your view on that statement?
Well, I've actually had that. After you do a review of the existing yoga research, write a grant application. You try and say that this work is there in its existence. It's real. There's published papers and so on. And then I'm stunned when I get the review on my grant saying, well, the research has already been done. And to me, this is just an excuse for lack of interest and lack of appreciation of the potential of these practices. There is so much work that needs to be done. I mean, at this point in time, we basically scratched the surface of yoga. The questions we've been answering with respect to yoga is, does yoga do anything at all? What does it do? Can it do something? Can it do anything? We have a lot to address in terms of dose response curve. How much yoga do you need? Over what period of time? And we don't have those dose response curve studies. I mean, Rob Saper did a study when he was here at Boston University comparing 2 doses of a yoga intervention for low back pain. That's one of the few studies that has looked at dose. And this is critical. I mean, you can't do pharmaceutical research unless you do dose response studies, and yet, we're not doing them yet. And that's true also for other contemplative studies, such as meditation practices. We have very little in terms of dose response. And then there's also mechanism. We need a lot of research on the underlying mechanisms, because scientists are not just happy with understanding that there's efficacy. They need to know where that efficacy is coming from to give them confidence that this is a real phenomenon. So we need a lot more research on efficacy, and on mechanism studies. And mechanism studies are more difficult. They're more expensive. And so that's another challenge that we face. And then finally, with yoga, it's a multi-component intervention. So one of the questions is, which component contributes to what? Are these 4 components that I've talked about, postures, relaxation, breathing, and meditation, are they additive? In other words, 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 = 4. Are they somehow duplicative? So 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 = 2. Or are they multiplicative? Are they synergistic so that 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 = 6? We don't know the answer to that question about how these different practices interact with each other, whether they're simply additive or facilitating each other. So that's another important question. What style of yoga? And some styles are much more focused on the asanas. Other styles are much more focused on the meditative component. So that's another very important question to address.
Right. There is a lot of questions in the chat. Before we go there, I just have one last question. This is about compliance and adherence. So a lot of issue is about how well people, once you randomize, how well they comply and adhere and do the practices. Majority of the behavioral interventions, adherence can be anywhere from 30% to 80%, depending upon how you define adherence and how you measure it and all of that. The common criticism you get from reviewers is, oh, X practice, the adherence is only 30%. Let's look at MBS audit as 80% adherence. Then you go back and look at the gold standard MBSR, which has become by default the gold standard to NIH, is they actually ask for you to sign a contract before they start randomizing these patients. So somehow there's a selection bias right there before they even enter the phase of randomization. And then they measure the adherence as 80%. So there's a lot of play there. And, I don't think of any behavioral intervention will have ever 100% adherence to it, unless it's a proven practice and there's a committed people who are doing it. So we are going to be straddling this phase of 30 to 70%, depending upon the population, depending upon the definitions, etc. So how do you tackle this at a level of fund application to, a certain level, there's a grantsmanship there, but it seems like they know the internal details, but they just won't accept it.
Yeah, so you have to pad your grant applications with those sections that say, how are we going to address adherence and compliance? And you devote a precious page of the grant application to that, and you come up with all kinds of strategies that you can to try and enhance compliance. If you have to, you pay them per yoga class. We actually did that with a study in the Department of Defense where we used yoga for PTSD and veterans. We were paying them to come to $20 per yoga class to come. But that is budgetarily difficult for many grant applications. So you have to come up with ways to encourage compliance, and that means interacting with the participants, maybe following up with them on a regular basis to address barriers to compliance. There's a lot of barriers to compliance. So for example, we've had patients come back, or participants in the study come back and say, I want to do the yoga, but I live in a one-bedroom apartment. We got 3 kids. I got no place to practice the yoga. And, I suggested very simply, is there a large closet you can sit in, turn on the light? And she said, actually, yeah, there is. I can try that. So you try and come up with novel ways to enhance compliance, to do much more follow-up with the patients. And it's also disease specific. So there are people that are really motivated, and there are people that are not really motivated. Diabetes is essentially a silent disease. They're not aware of their HbA1c, and there's no symptoms that they're experiencing. Whereas in chronic insomnia, the symptoms are there every night, and these people are tortured. And so they are highly motivated to practice. They'll do anything to try and get rid of the insomnia because it plagues them day in and day out. So that's a factor as well. So you just have to push as hard as you can to try and come up with novel and creative ways to encourage compliance. This is not just a problem with yoga, it's a problem with, as you say, all of behavioral medicine, cognitive behavioral therapy, you name it, any kind of intervention in which the participant has to do something is prone to this kind of problem.
Thank you so much. And as you mentioned that yoga is inclusive of meditation in it, but the common terminology has become yoga and meditation. And this has become such a common terminology, even under NIH umbrella, they define it that way. So how do you even waste your time correcting that?
No, you don't waste your time correcting it. They're just basically talking out of ignorance. It's true that, a substantial fraction of the yoga that is taught in the West is just asanas, just physical postures and exercises. So in some sense, what they're saying is true. And to elaborate on it, they're saying yoga and meditation, or mindful yoga. And these are terms that I think deserve to be relegated to the dustbin over time. But this is a matter of education. It's a matter of the yoga community standing up and educating the public about what yoga is. Because on the one extreme, yoga is viewed as simply a bendy form of exercise that only thin women can practice. And on the other extreme, yoga is a religion. It's part of the Hindu religion. You practice yoga, you become a Hindu. And both of these are completely false representations of yoga. Yoga is able to be practiced by virtually any population, and traditional yoga obviously includes meditation and pranayama as important components of that. So I think it's a matter of education, and it's a matter of time. And time is on our side, because what we're seeing over the past decade is this dramatic increase in the prevalence of yoga practice in the population. And so that increase in prevalence of yoga is an increase of all kinds of yoga, not just the yoga posture types, but also the traditional yoga practices. And with time, I think we'll persevere, and people will start to understand that yoga is a contemplative practice. I mean, it irks me as well. I mean, I've heard mindfulness researchers say, oh, yoga, that's just a form of exercise. And they should know better. There's no excuse for that. If they're studying mindfulness and contemplative traditions, there's no excuse for not understanding the breadth and depth of different types of practices, and that yoga is historically a contemplative practice. I mean, for that matter, Buddha was a yogi. So, I mean, there's really no excuse for that kind of misconception.
All right, so I'm going to go to the chat box and bring out some of the questions starting from the top, no particular order here. Deepthi Rajashekar, I think she's from Calgary, Canada. She's asking, thank you for the talk, very informative. Can you please elaborate on the implication of yoga on neuroplasticity, especially in the context of rehabilitating subacute stroke patients?
There actually is work on traumatic brain injury and stroke. So these are clearly brain damaged individuals where, you know, there's actual physical tissue damage to the brains. And, you know, there are improvements that are being monitored. I'm not sure that we have research yet to actually neuroimage whether there's changes in brain structure that have been improved yet, but we do have a number of behavioral studies that have looked in both of these disorders that are starting to show improvements in functioning, which obviously is an indication of improvements in central nervous system functioning.
Yeah, while I'm at it, I also want to say you are an editor-in-chief of one of the international yoga journals. What I have not seen is the meaningful, clinically important differences in the outcome measures. There are so many scales that are used for different outcomes. Perhaps it's time to come up with some kind of a statement about each outcome and what is a meaningful difference. For example, awareness scale, there are only 5 points. Even if there's a 0.7% increase, is that meaningful or not? So something like that, I think we need to start putting it out because of varying differences in the outcome measures used, and just saying that it is meaningful using a number increase makes it really difficult to interpret what exactly happened.
Well, I think that's true for some of the constructs like mindfulness, newer constructs like mindfulness and spirituality and so on. But I think much of the research is really parallel to other research. I mean, if you're studying diabetes, there's no question you're looking at HbA1c and blood glucose levels. And so in many of the yoga therapy type studies, which really dominates the field of yoga research, the outcome measures are dictated by the standards in the field. And the standards in the field are well established. So, you know, in insomnia, we have the Insomnia Severity Index as a behavioral measure, and we have polysomnography as an objective measure. You know, in some disorders, there are no objective measures. So in depression, we're using the Hamilton interview scale or the Beck Depression Inventory as a self-report, and those are accepted standards. So most of the yoga research is really using those accepted standards. And that's fine. But even if we're going into the more contemplative things to try and determine mechanisms like mindfulness, there are a lot of mindfulness scales. And those are being constantly refined. And so I think we're moving forward in that. And we're starting to see statistically significant correlations that really give us confidence about the mechanism. So in our studies, for example, stress, resilience, and mindfulness constantly all moving together, very consistently moving together, suggesting that these are mechanistically related. And that really makes sense because that's exactly where stress regulation is taking place in that whole idea of change in regulation of the attention networks in metacognition.
So Mahi I think she's from Bangalore, thank God she's awake at this time at night. She's asking, very informative and enlightening, how is metabolism and meditation linked?
Metabolism, meditation. Well, typically metabolism slows down. I mean, the whole idea that what happens during meditation is that systems tend to quiet down, and that includes the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It includes the sympathetic nervous system, and it includes metabolism as well. And studies actually by Herbert Benson's group has really quantified this most effectively. They've shown actually reductions in metabolism. I mean, in fact, the earliest research that Herb Benson did was actually on transcendental meditation, and what they showed is that during transcendental meditation, metabolism does drop, and it drops dramatically. It drops lower than it does when you go to sleep at night. So it is actually a very discrete and powerful reduction in metabolism. That's what contributed to Herb Benson's coining this construct of the relaxation response, the opposite of the fight or flight response, in which you see increases in metabolism.
Hannah Thatcher, I think she's an occupational therapist, if I'm correct. And she's asking, have you come across any research supporting yoga for an intervention of patients experiencing symptoms of psychosis?
Yes, there's a mushrooming field, in fact, in the studies that are being done on yoga for schizophrenia. And this is by a number of labs across the world. And probably the foremost lab that's done the most studies on this is based at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences in Bengaluru, which is India's premier psychiatric hospital and research, mental health research institution. And they've really pioneered a lot of the work showing changes in schizophrenia in a positive way with yoga interventions. And it surprised me. I mean, if you'd asked me 25 years ago, can yoga fix and help with schizophrenia, I would have been extremely skeptical. I mean, this is a serious psychotic condition. And here we are with dozens of papers and now review papers being published on yoga for schizophrenia. So yes, I think there is traction in this area. I think it's important that the yoga interventions delivered to these patients obviously be delivered appropriately, because if you're asking people to meditate, they have to meditate appropriately. I mean, I've seen people indicate that, yoga and meditation are counterindicated for psychosis, and that's not based upon any evidence. But I believe that indeed, if you ask a psychotic person to focus their attention and they start focusing on the voices in their head, well, they're going to precipitate an event. So it's important that the meditation be done appropriately, and teaching yoga to a patient is very different than teaching yoga to the general population. There are much more safety and concerns involved in teaching yoga to patients, so it has to be done by experts who are trained to understand the vulnerabilities of the population they're working with. But the results for schizophrenia have been surprising.
Yeah. Tulsi, I think you wanted to support the audience questions. Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Bala. And Hannah, did you have anything to ask in terms of a follow-up question?
No, I think unless there was any resources, working on an inpatient psych unit, and we're considering adding, we've done sort of like chair yoga groups to make it accessible for everybody, but considering adding a weekly yoga group, but wanting to make sure it's done right. And it is an acute unit. So, we definitely have some people that maybe aren't there yet, but we have, a heap of people that would really benefit, but want to make sure that we have the research to support adding that intervention weekly. So if there was any resources you had.
Well, the research is easily obtainable on PubMed. And as I said, one of the leading groups is NIMHANS. Gangadhar was one of the key authors, who was the director of NIMHANS for a while. And so that group has had the most publications, but there are other groups out there. And there's also now a field we call, and I showed the website of the International Association of Yoga Therapists. There are yoga therapists who are yoga teachers who are now sort of developing expertise in how to teach for special populations with specific disorders. And it's likely there's yoga therapists out there who have some expertise and history in working with psychotic patients. And so you can contact the IAYT and see if you can find such a therapist and have that individual consult with you on his or her experiences with teaching yoga to psychotic patients. And of course, you can contact the authors of the studies to see what specific interventions they were using.
Thank you so much.
I think we had a few more questions in the chat. Alka is asking, a lot of studies have been done on healthy individuals. Have systematic studies been done on diagnosed cases of anxiety and mood disorders?
Oh, yes. In fact, there's more studies done on medical and psychological conditions than on healthy populations, really. Because that tends to be what's more fundable. And so that's why you see that emphasis. I mean, that's the first thing you go to is, can we help people who really need assistance? In terms of depression, I do have a number of colleagues that are working in this area. Lisa Ubalacker is based at Brown University, is working on yoga for depression. My group has worked with yoga for generalized anxiety disorder. We published 2 preliminary trials showing that we could improve the scores of generalized anxiety disorder. And I worked with colleagues at Boston University and at that time Mass General And, you know, we use that data to apply for a multi-site grant in Boston at Boston University and MGH. And that was a, you know, $4.5 million study. And it was done over 6 years, and we had very good results. We empaneled over 200 subjects. We had 3 groups. One was practicing Kundalini Yoga. The other was doing cognitive behavioral therapy using the gold standard technique by the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders at BU. And the other one was a stress education control. And the CBT was the strongest, but the Kundalini Yoga was very close. And for a first trial, for that degree of efficacy that we saw in that study, it's really remarkable. We were very encouraged by that. And that was published in a major medical journal, JAMA Psychiatry. So that hopefully will inspire other researchers to move further on study of anxiety disorders.
Thank you, Dr. Khalsa. We have one last question from the chat, and then we'll get to a question from the audience via video. Meg Bolin is asking, similarly to Alka's question, I would be fascinated to see what potential yoga has as a proactive therapy in childbirthing and lactation experiences, particularly given how many women made up the large-scale UK study.
Yeah, there's no question that that is a whole area of research, prenatal and postnatal yoga practice. There's a number of studies. It is a growing field. There's some remarkable studies, and some studies have actually shown positive impacts on birth weight and child development in terms of the yoga. So that's definitely a field that has shown a good deal of publication. And we have a chapter in our book, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare, that's focused on reproductive issues. So that is definitely a field that is already there. And, you know, prenatal yoga is actually a very, very common and popular form of yoga in the general population. There's a lot of pregnant women practicing yoga.
Thank you. Mayur, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thanks, Tulsi. Satbir, big fan of your work, so thank you so much for this talk. Really appreciate your time and the volume and body of work that you've done over the last, your entire career. I have a more open-ended question for you. There has clearly been a lot of beautiful work that's being done at the intersection of yoga and meditation and neuroscience at large, or cognitive science. What would you feel? Do you feel like there's a moonshot result or a moonshot project that needs to happen so that yoga and meditation can take more, get the front page that it so rightly deserves? And I'm curious to understand, given how much you've worked on this topic, how you see what's missing. For example, do you think there's some mechanism of action that we need to figure out, or do we need to get a study that's a randomized control that's at scale of, like, say, 10,000 people? Or are we talking about, do you want someone to have a deeply, profoundly mystical experience and then show that in under controlled lab study?
Well, I would say it's getting into the strong journals. I mean, it's as simple as that. That's what drives a lot of science is people seeing things published in Science and Nature, New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, JAMA. That's where we need to be getting our publications and showing that that's the case. I mean, there's like 3-4 publications, including ours in JAMA, over the entire past 50 years, and nothing in New England Journal of Medicine. So I mean, that's the challenge we face, and one of the biggest areas I think that we can contribute to modern medicine really is in yoga's particular utility and relevance to non-communicable diseases, both as prevention and treatment, because the risk factors for these diseases are lifestyle, their physical activity, poor dietary choices, dysfunctional health behaviors like excessive alcohol consumption and smoking, and chronic stress, I would add. And modern medicine really is not good at dealing with all of those risk factors. I mean, it just is not. And yoga is excellent at working at that. The self-regulation deals with the stress, the mind-body awareness and mindfulness improves dietary and physical activity choices. The spirituality changes life meaning and purpose in a positive direction to remove chronic stress. The self-regulation is very good at stress and emotion regulation. Yoga has all the ingredients to be an excellent treatment and prevention for non-communicable disease. 90% of deaths in the US are due to non-communicable disease. Forget COVID. this is the burden in modern medicine. COVID's nice and it's big, but you know, compared to NCDs, it's small. And if we can really show that we can prevent NCDs, especially over the longer term, and that we can deal with NCDs and reduce symptoms of people that have NCDs, I think that's really where a big impact can happen. And for me, a big impact is really bringing yoga to a population that is really suffering, and that is our children and adolescents. The mental health burden that they're facing right now is really unrecognized by the general population. 17% of adolescents have actively contemplated suicide. And the cumulative prevalence of having a DSM psychological condition from age 9 to 21 is 80%. So there's a huge mental health burden in our kids. And for me, the other thing about children and adolescents is that they are the future. If we can give them these strategies and these skills in the schools, that will prevent the NCDs in the future and also improve their functioning as human beings. So to me, that's a big impact in terms of society. Whether that will be fundable or not, I mean, we've submitted our share of grant applications for that. And a lot of them were turned down. It's you know, yoga research is not easy. And this is what I tell young yoga researchers that come to me. I say, you know, you better be prepared for this. Yoga research is a form of career suicide. And, you know, unless you're prepared to really undergo the knocks and be persistent, totally persistent, you know, it's a tough sell.
Awesome. Thank you so much for, you know, your work, your inspiration. It's really a privilege and pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khalsa, and for answering these questions and for all of the resources that you've shared. I know there may be some few more questions that the audience may have for you, but I also want to just be mindful of time, and I want to thank you all so much for being here and engaging in this discussion and learning and exploration around yoga and the science behind it. I want to very quickly just share my slides again. Can everyone see my slides? Yes? Okay. So thank you again, Dr. Khalsa. It's been a pleasure having you share your immense body of work with us. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate and communicate with you more and learn from you. For those of you who want to stay in touch and learn more about what's happening in this field, as well as join our future events, I just want to invite you all to stay connected with us on social media. This is the best and easiest way to get updates on our future events and programs. You can join us on Twitter or LinkedIn and stay in touch to learn more about. As soon as we have any event or program, we'll be sharing it on here. And then finally, in the chat, Nasha should be sharing a link where you can fill out a form to be on our mailing list, and you can get updates on our future events and programs, and also share if there's any interest in specific types of collaboration that you want to do with us, or any questions or comments you have for us, so that we can continue to improve our programs in the future. And thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to see you next month for our speaker series